Hello, everybody. I wanted to do a edutainment video about the history of hats and specifically some of the sociology behind hats and also some of the design evolution that occurred. And the reason why is recently I've made a few hats. We had a kind of a spell of a very cold and wintry weather, and I was kind of stuck home for a few days. And I had an old sheepskin left over from decades ago that was just sitting and occupying space, so I decided to go ahead and make something useful out of that. So, looking for some of the history behind hats, I looked at masterclass.com has an article, as well as hatswork.com. Both had articles about kind of a history of the design of hats, but they did not really look at some of the aspects that a hat wearer or a hat maker would look at. And I think it's pretty interesting to think about how hats developed from a sociological or anthropological perspective. So that's sort of what I did, and I think to a certain extent I kind of recreated history through the process of making these thus far three hats. So, first of all, most likely the first primitive hat wear would have been a pelt or a skin of an animal. And there's two major ways to skin a fur-bearing animal. One is to cut linearly down from the chin down to the butt. That way you open up into a flat pelt, and that's going to have to be in some way secured, stitched, fastened together some way. And then the other way is to simply go across the very back of the back legs and kind of a line across the back of the animal, and then essentially turn their hide inside out and pull it up over their head. That way you get a cylindrical shaped pelt without any big seams. It would not require any seams or stitch work. You just simply then tan that and slip it over your head, and then fold it over in the front to display the head, and drape the legs then down behind you. Would have been probably one of the easiest ways to make a cap. So after that, I would imagine in time, as people got more sophisticated, actual stitched and tailored clothing developed, then the hat would have naturally followed. And I think along those lines, probably the next kind of formal headwear would have been most likely essentially a scarf or a band of cloth, a band of animal skin that would have been wrapped around the head. And then in time would have been fashioned in a turban to completely encase the head. Would have most likely been the next step. Then, as we got away from kind of primitive wearing skins and pelts and basic clothing, it would have then evolved to be a little bit more sophisticated, and fabric would have come more into being, and we would have then most likely developed essentially this Kozak hat that I'm wearing now, which is in some ways rather primitive, but is also in some ways kind of a development and a more sophisticated type of a thing. So essentially you start with a sheepskin band, as simply like with wrapping a scarf around your head, but then it was then made more sophisticated by putting a top of cloth on that. Not a whole lot of stitching, again, very primitive. You just simply stitch around, attaching the pelt to the cloth, and then turn it inside out, and you've got a cap. Pretty simple. Not a whole lot of stitching or anything would have been required for that. And so then from there, it would have been, I think, probably maybe for whatever reason, kind of out of fashion to just simply wear pelts and skins and things. And so then fabric hats would have been developed along with felt as well. And there we begin to see, again, another kind of an evolution along these lines. And this would have involved making completely cloth caps of various types, as we see as we get into the Middle Ages, Elizabethan era, the Renaissance era. Very sophisticated hats. Some are so elaborate that they're really impractical as far as actually protecting your head. But still, at the time, as far as developing fabric hats for the ladies, hoods and bonnets would have started to develop as we got away from simply wrapping scarves or cloths or whatever around your head. So along those lines, then there's basically three types of flat caps, which are completely fabric made. And so the first is a little bit like the Mongolian style of cap, which is essentially a kind of a dome of fabric sewn out of these triangular type of pieces. I'll grab a few here. And then again, continuing with a ring of pelt or fur or whatever. So essentially triangles of various different proportions, wide or narrow, or what have you, would have been used to create a what is called a flat cap, but it's in fact basically a domed hat, and that's the newsboy. One of the two major types of flat cap that is currently made commercially, and so they just simply make these triangular pieces, sew those in to make a dome. The second major type of flat cap is what I call kind of the fishtail type. And so if you look at the pattern for this, it looks kind of like a fish which has been skinned down the belly again and then flayed out. So it lays flat. So you've got essentially a round part here. And then these two parts are then actually split so that they will cup and shape around the back of the head. So that is the other major type of flat cap. And then thirdly, what I have is another flat cap, which is in fact quite primitive compared to the others, in that it is quite a simple design, easy to make, doesn't really require a sophisticated pattern or anything, but essentially you just cut out two circles of fabric and cut a hole in the bottom one to accommodate your head. So from this type, you can then make a beret pretty easily, and you could also make with an extended side essentially what was worn in Tudor times, with the addition of a kind of a very short brim would have also been incorporated. And on top of that, as well, you could make an engineer cap by, again, extending a a brim below this, and then adding what I think is a real important development, and that is the visor, the brim, or the peak, as it is called. And so I had actually not really been that familiar with this term, but actually the British use the term peak for this brim that comes and extends out in front of the eyes. And so that brings up a very important part that I have learned as a part of making these hats, and that is there's a lot of very fine nuances as far as, particularly looking at this hat, how far forward are you going to bring it, how much extra material do you need to accommodate your head, how loose is it going to be in the side. And so the use of this visor is going to really change the dynamics of the cap from just kind of a loose thing that sits on your head like a beret, which is never necessarily going to stay exactly in one position, or a Tudor cap, which is a little bit less protective of the eyes and whatnot as far as the sun or wind or rain is concerned. So one of the benefits I found as far as making your own is that it allows you to do some of these fine nuances and fit it specifically to your head. And so going back along those lines, what I had learned again through making these caps is that one of the best aspects of it is that you can actually fit them to fit your specific head. And so while there's lots of plenty nice, good, serviceable caps out there, they are not necessarily made to fit your head. And a lot of the patterns that I found, in fact, do not necessarily fit my head or maybe any human head. So when I was going to make this Ushanka here, and that's another classic, kind of a primitive early hat, I'll go into some details about it in a second, I found a pattern like this, which in fact is not deep or low enough in the back to protect the back of the head, and in fact leaves you kind of exposed to the elements back there. So again, one of the benefit of making a bespoke hat for yourself is that you can then adapt the pattern to fit your head and offer you more protection. So this particular Ushanka definitely does that. And so another aspect of the particular tweaking and whatnot of making your own as opposed to buying one is that you can do something that would be a little bit atypical. So a lot of times a snap or a buckle would be used on these, but the thing about those is those are made out of metal, and this is a hat that is used in extremely cold weather, and that metal is going to feel very cold under your chin. So I just simply put on a button. Now the button is not as easy to open and close. However, once it's in place, it will not leave any dangling strings to get in the way of what you might be doing. And it really stays securely in place. So while a homemade product is not necessarily going to be as pretty or fancy as a store-bought, it allows you to do that type of thing that's going to be really quite helpful and useful. So another aspect of the evolution of the cap taking a little bit of a step back. So this Ushanka basically started off as is a profile of the human head, followed by a strip, again, much like just a simple strip of material to kind of fill in between the two profiles of the head. Very primitive, not a whole lot of engineering and whatnot, not a whole lot of stitching like with the newsboys, just a stitching monster. Lots and lots of stitching required to make that, but the materials themselves are pretty cheap. And so once the electric sewing machine was invented, well, no problem at all making caps like that. But back in the Neolithic, Pleistocene, all that type of era, a skin would have been available, and just simply cutting out strips and shaped parts out of that skin and then sewing those together would have been a lot easier, really. And so, the benefit of making your own is that you can cut these pieces, to particularly fit you and in such a way that is going to be suitable for you. So that's basically the summary of it. I really recommend you look into the Kozak hat, and the Kozaks themselves were actually a very important people as far as the foundation of Russia and the history of Russia itself. I won't go really into that too much. In this particular hat, I have to give credit. There's another YouTuber that I'll mention, a German guy who is, I think, really into stitching and also making historical garments. I think is really his tour de force. And so he essentially copied a picture of the Duke of Windsor. And again, through this process, I've learned a lot of history and whatnot that I didn't necessarily even want to to learn. So the Duke of Windsor is pictured in 1943 with a very loose cap, although I don't think it is after this pattern. I think it's in that kind of fish skin pattern flat cap, but it's very loose, which is what kind of occurred in the 30s and the 40s, as they had a very big and loose flat cap. And so he copied that to come up with this one. But the beauty of this is very primitive and simple. There's not all the engineering that goes into play that you have to do the fish skin design of a flat cap. And again, the benefits of doing it yourself is that you can repurpose some old blankets or whatnot and have a really heavy material, which is much heavier and going to be more duty purposed than anything you can buy in the store. And another reason to do your own is that there's so much polyester out there today, and we know that's really bad for your skin and really detrimental to the environment. So getting away from that is also a big part of making your own bespoke articles, even though it's kind of a pain. And for me personally, the geometry was kind of a challenge, particularly of the Kozak hat, because I had measured it out perfectly to fit the outside circumference. But then as I stitched, of course, the circumference shrank, and I really ran into problems then with the length of the band itself was a big pain. So anyway, I hope that you get out there and make some hats yourself and are not afraid of trying new things and failing. And along the way, you'll learn a lot about geometry, history, and sociology. So thanks a lot. I appreciate you liking, making any kind of comments you might want. That would be helpful. And I have a lot of books related to deep thought, sociology, and history on Amazon. You can find me there. So Thanks a lot. You're all awesome, and have a good day.